He woke up early that morning, just as he did every day, with the same quiet routine that had carried him through life. The sun was barely touching the rooftops of his neighborhood, painting everything in a soft orange glow. He liked mornings like this when the world felt calm and still, before it woke up to its usual chaos. He moved through his apartment with practiced efficiency, making a simple breakfast, checking his messages, and preparing for the day. His neighbors would later say he seemed like any ordinary man, polite, calm, and dependable. But they didn't know the truth. They couldn't have imagined that behind the quiet eyes and measured movements was someone trained to face dangers most people couldn't even imagine. The man had always kept his past to himself. He didn't talk about the Navy SEAL days, the missions that demanded precision, courage, and a mind that worked faster than anyone could see. He didn't brag about the discipline that shaped his body and mind. To those around him, he was simply a neighbor, a man who worked hard, smiled politely, and rarely caused trouble. He liked it that way. Life had enough chaos without inviting more. On this particular morning, he went through the small ritual he had followed for years, checking the perimeter of his home, making sure everything was in order. He noticed nothing out of the ordinary. The street was quiet, the cars were parked in the usual places, and the neighbors were going about their morning routines. He even waved at the elderly woman across the street, who nodded with a smile. These small moments grounded him, reminded him of a world worth protecting. He stepped outside to take a brief walk, breathing in the cool morning air. His movements were smooth, controlled, almost like a ritual. As he walked, he noticed a few things that didn't sit right with him. A couple of cars parked too long near the corner, young men lingering on the street who seemed to watch more than they should. He didn't panic. That wasn't his way. He simply observed, stored the details in his mind, and moved on. Awareness had always been his first line of defense. The morning passed like any other. He returned home, made coffee, and settled into his work at the small home office he had set up. He spent hours focusing on tasks that required patience, precision, and clarity. He liked these moments because they allowed his mind to rest in a way, even if his body was always ready for the unexpected. His life was simple but structured, and he liked it that way. It wasn't until the afternoon that the first signs of trouble appeared. At first it was subtle. A sound outside, the faint echo of movement across the yard. He paused, listening carefully, noticing details most would miss. The sound of a gate creaking, footsteps soft but deliberate, the distant murmur of voices trying to hide their presence. Something wasn't right. His hand brushed against the edge of the table, a small gesture of instinct. He stepped outside again, casually, as if nothing had happened. His eyes scanned the surroundings, his body tense beneath the calm exterior. The street was quiet, but there was an unease in the air, a heaviness that made him alert. He noticed shadows where there shouldn't be any, movements behind windows, and cars that had appeared without explanation. His mind catalogued every detail, silently forming a plan for what might come next. By evening, the situation escalated without warning. The quiet that had defined his day was shattered by the sound of breaking glass. He froze, listening as his home, his sanctuary, was being invaded. The sound was deliberate, aggressive. He could hear footsteps inside, the crash of objects falling, doors being forced open. It wasn't random. This was targeted, meant to send a message. He moved with calm urgency, slipping into a different version of himself that had been dormant for years. The man who walked the streets as a neighbor now became someone else entirely, focused, alert, precise. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. Instead, he assessed, calculated, and prepared. He could hear the voices of the intruders, hear their laughter, hear the undercurrent of hatred that motivated them. The gang believed he was just an ordinary man, vulnerable and unaware. They were wrong. When he finally stepped into view, they were still inside his home, ransacking the rooms. Furniture overturned, pictures broken, belongings thrown across the floor. Their faces were filled with confidence, arrogance, and a dangerous underestimation of the man they had come to intimidate. They didn't see the quiet power in his stance, the readiness in his movements, the calm that masked a storm. He spoke, but his voice was low and controlled, almost casual. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply identified their presence, cataloged their numbers, and let them feel the weight of being observed by someone far more capable than they could imagine. The gang faltered slightly, surprised by his composure. Their confidence wavered. He didn't confront them physically that night. That wasn't the point. He let them make their mistakes. Let them reveal themselves in ways they wouldn't understand until it was too late. His mind was working in patterns they couldn't predict. Every movement, every sound, every decision logged and analyzed. By the time they left, thinking they had sent a message and caused chaos, he had already turned the night into an opportunity. Every step they had taken, every word they had spoken was now part of his preparation for what would come next. The neighbors watched from behind curtains, whispering among themselves, unsure what to do. Some wanted to call the police immediately. Others feared retaliation if they intervened. But the man himself remained calm. He began carefully documenting the damage, taking note of what had been taken, broken, or defaced. Yet there was no anger in his actions, only a focused clarity. His calmness was unsettling, a quiet signal that the situation was far from ordinary. As the night deepened, he stood in the center of his living room, surveying the destruction. Broken glass glittered in the dim light. Furniture was overturned, and the sense of violation was strong. Yet amid the chaos, there was a plan forming. He would restore what was lost, yes, but he would also ensure that the people responsible understood, in ways they couldn't ignore, that they had misjudged him. This wasn't just about property. This was about respect, about boundaries, about the consequences of underestimating someone whose life had been built on discipline, skill, and resilience. Sleep would come later, if it came at all. He checked his surroundings again, moving quietly through the apartment, touching doors, windows, and walls, ensuring everything was secure. His mind didn't rest, replaying the events, noting every detail and considering possibilities. He had been trained for missions that required focus and endurance far beyond what most people could imagine. This situation, though dangerous, was just another challenge, another puzzle to solve. By the end of the night, he sat at the small kitchen table, a cup of coffee in his hands, staring into the quiet darkness outside. The world had seemed so ordinary just hours before, and now it felt fragile, exposed. Yet he felt no fear. Fear was a tool, a signal, a momentary flash that had long since been mastered. What remained was resolve, clarity, and a plan. He allowed himself a small smile, almost imperceptible as he considered the irony. People had assumed his quiet life meant vulnerability, had believed he could be intimidated and controlled. But those who truly understood him, who knew the years of training, the missions, and the discipline, would know that he was far from ordinary. The calm exterior masked a force ready to act when the time was right. As he finally prepared for bed, he didn't feel the weight of the night's events as a burden. Instead, he felt the clarity of purpose. He would rebuild, yes, but more importantly, he would ensure the neighborhood, the community, and even the people who had trespassed knew that strength often lies hidden, that appearances can be deceiving, and that respect is earned, not assumed. Outside, the night was still. The street quiet once more. The gang had left, unaware that their actions had already triggered something far greater than they could comprehend. Inside, the man sat quietly, planning, observing, and preparing for what would come next. The day had begun like any other, but it had ended with a shift in balance, a subtle warning that the ordinary man they thought they knew was, in fact, someone trained to face far greater threats, someone who would not be underestimated again. And in that quiet, measured way that defined him, he allowed himself to rest just enough to remain alert, knowing that tomorrow would bring more challenges, but challenges he was ready to meet, with precision, skill, and the unshakable calm of someone who had faced much worse and survived. The night ended not with fear but with a promise that life, no matter how ordinary it seemed, could reveal extraordinary strength when pushed to the edge. The next morning, the neighborhood was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The usual sounds of children laughing, dogs barking, and neighbors chatting seemed muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He stepped outside, surveying the street with the same calm, deliberate gaze he had always carried. Everything looked ordinary at first glance, but he knew better. Subtle changes always gave away intentions, and he could see them if he paid close attention. Tire marks on the curb, lingering shadows in alleyways, cars parked just a little too long in front of houses. It all told a story he had already begun to read. Inside, his home was still a mess. Broken glass, overturned furniture, and the signs of intrusion were stark reminders of what had happened. But he didn't dwell on anger or fear. Those emotions were tools for people who needed them. He had learned long ago to use focus instead. He moved through the apartment carefully, touching every surface, assessing, cataloging, and planning. Each step was methodical, precise, and quiet. He was aware of every sound, every vibration in the floor, every shadow cast by the weak morning light. The neighbors whispered among themselves, fearful to approach. Some had seen the gang leaving the night before, their faces full of arrogance and hate. They worried about retaliation, worried that any involvement could bring harm, but he didn't need them to intervene. He had learned to rely on himself, and that was enough. He spent the morning documenting everything meticulously. Pictures, notes, observations. Everything was collected and stored in a way that would allow him to act decisively when the time came. As he worked, fragments of his past drifted into his thoughts. He remembered the intense training, the missions where failure was not an option, and the situations that demanded calm under pressure. It had all shaped him into someone who could handle this without panic or rash action. Even as he moved calmly, there was a simmering awareness of danger. He knew the gang had underestimated him. They believed he was just another man, someone they could intimidate and frighten. That ignorance was their first mistake. It gave him the advantage. He didn't need to respond immediately. Instead, he chose patience. Every moment was an opportunity to gather more information, to learn their routines, and to prepare for the confrontation he knew was inevitable. By afternoon, he had started observing them from a distance. The gang moved with the confidence of people who had never faced real resistance. They were careless, loud, and predictable. He watched them, learning their habits, noting their weaknesses, memorizing faces, and listening to conversations he could catch from the street. Each detail added to the picture he was quietly building, a map of threats and opportunities. At one point, he spotted them at a nearby convenience store. They laughed, jeered, and seemed unaware that someone was watching. His mind cataloged everything: the way they moved, how they carried themselves, the items they bought, and even the subtle dynamics among them. He noted who seemed the most reckless, who was the lookout, and who was the one others followed blindly. It was a puzzle, and he was solving it quietly, piece by piece. While he observed, he also made sure his home was secure. Doors were reinforced, windows double-checked, and alarms, though subtle, were in place. Every precaution was taken, but his focus was never on fear. It was on strategy. He knew he could handle any immediate threat. What mattered now was preparation, patience, and precision. Evening fell, bringing with it the shadows that always made the street feel narrower, smaller, more confined. He continued to watch the gang from a safe distance, noticing their patterns more clearly in the fading light. They gathered in small groups, moved between houses, and occasionally glanced toward his property. He noticed their attempts to intimidate, subtle gestures meant to scare anyone who might resist. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Later, a neighbor cautiously approached him, concern written across her face. She whispered hurriedly about the gang's continued harassment, about items missing from yards, about threats scrawled on fences and walls. He listened, nodded, and reassured her in a calm voice that carried authority without alarm. But inside, he was already processing the new information, integrating it into the mental map he had been building. Every threat, every movement, every act of intimidation was a clue. He spent the rest of the night planning. He mapped routes, imagined scenarios, and considered every possible outcome. His mind worked like a machine, trained to anticipate moves, calculate probabilities, and prepare for contingencies. Sleep came only in short bursts, moments where his body allowed rest while his mind remained alert. Even then, his dreams were of training, of missions, of strategy and survival. His past life as a Navy SEAL was not something he could leave behind. It was woven into his instincts, his thoughts, and his every reaction. As he moved through the next few days, the gang continued their small acts of intimidation. Nothing drastic yet, nothing that could directly harm him physically. They thought they had control. They thought they were intimidating a man who would bend under pressure. Every act, however, became a lesson for him. Every mistake they made, every careless laugh, every loud gesture was noted, stored, and remembered. They were teaching him about themselves without even realizing it. He began taking subtle actions to test their reactions. A small item moved, a shadow noticed, a light flicked at a certain hour. Nothing obvious, nothing confrontational, just small adjustments to observe their responses. And they responded exactly as he expected, with confusion, irritation, and growing paranoia. The advantage was shifting, though they didn't know it yet. Throughout it all, he maintained his ordinary life. He went to work, interacted with neighbors politely, and even smiled at children playing nearby. The contrast was striking. To the outside world, he was calm, approachable, and harmless. But beneath the surface, every movement was calculated, every word considered, every action part of a larger plan. He was playing a long game, and patience was his weapon. One evening, he caught a glimpse of one of the gang members trying to sneak onto his property. The man froze for just a moment as their eyes met across the fence. That moment told him everything he needed to know. They were starting to notice something was different. They were beginning to realize that the man they had tried to intimidate was not as ordinary as he seemed. He didn't confront them directly. That would have been unnecessary. Instead, he made a subtle adjustment to his surroundings, a light here, a sound there that sent a quiet warning. The gang member hesitated, looking around, and eventually backed away. It was a small victory, but it was significant. It proved that even without direct action, his presence and awareness were enough to start shifting the balance. In the quiet hours of the night, he reflected on the situation. He thought about the principles that had guided him through the toughest moments of his life: patience, observation, discipline, and precision. He understood that strength was not always shown through immediate action. Sometimes it was shown through restraint, through calculated patience, and through the quiet assurance that when action came, it would be decisive and complete. He also thought about his community. He cared about the people around him even if they didn't fully understand who he was. He wanted them to be safe, to feel secure, and to know that there was someone capable watching over them without needing to announce it. That sense of responsibility, instilled long ago, was part of why he had remained in the neighborhood despite the rising tension. He wasn't looking for conflict. He was looking for justice, protection, and balance. The gang, meanwhile, grew restless. Their arrogance began to crack under the invisible pressure. Small mistakes, previously unnoticed, became more frequent. Their confidence faltered as they tried to assert control over someone who refused to be intimidated. Each day they unknowingly provided him with more information, more opportunities, more insight into their weaknesses. He moved quietly, observing, learning, and preparing. Every action, every decision was informed by years of training, by experience, and by the understanding that true strength is often hidden until it must be revealed. The night was still, the street quiet, and the world seemed unaware of the storm gathering silently in the mind of one man who had already decided the rules of engagement. By the end of the week, he had a plan forming in his mind. It wasn't a plan for immediate revenge, but for a series of moves that would restore balance, ensure safety, and demonstrate consequences without unnecessary chaos. He would act decisively, but only when the time was right, only when the advantage was complete. Patience had brought him this far. It would carry him further still. And in that calm, measured way that defined him, he prepared for what was coming. The neighborhood remained unaware of the depth of his abilities. The gang remained blind to the threat they had created, and the world continued in its ordinary rhythm. But beneath the surface, the quiet, methodical preparation of one man was already changing the course of events. When action finally came, it would be precise, unrelenting, and undeniable. A reflection of a life shaped by discipline, courage, and an unshakable sense of purpose. The week ended as it began, with quiet streets, distant sounds of life, and a man who appeared ordinary, calm and approachable, yet beneath the surface he was anything but ordinary. He was ready, aware, and prepared. The calm before the storm was not a moment of weakness. It was the gathering of strength, focus, and resolve that would ensure that when the time came, nothing would be left to chance. And those who had tried to intimidate him would discover, far too late, the true measure of the man they had underestimated. The days that followed the attack on his home were filled with a strange mix of tension and calm. To the outside world, he moved through his routines as usual, going to work, checking on neighbors, tending to small tasks around his home. But beneath the surface, he was far from ordinary. Every step he took, every glance he gave, and every sound he noticed was part of a careful observation. A silent map being built in his mind of the people who had tried to intimidate him. He had begun quietly gathering intelligence. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. He didn't want to alarm anyone. and he didn't want the gang to suspect that he was already aware of their every move. He started with small things, noting who came and went from certain houses, observing the patterns of cars on the streets, and watching the way the gang interacted when they thought no one was paying attention. Their arrogance made them careless, and that carelessness was information. Every laugh, every argument, every small mistake became a piece of the puzzle. He learned quickly that one of the men liked to patrol the street at night, boasting loudly about how no one could scare them. Another was reckless, often wandering far from the group, leaving gaps that could be used to predict their next actions. He observed how they relied on intimidation rather than skill, how they underestimated the world around them because they had never met anyone who wouldn't yield to fear. And in all of this, he remained invisible to them, a shadow moving quietly, noting everything, planning for what was coming. During the day, he maintained the image of a man who was simply recovering from a disruption in his life. He repaired broken windows, reorganized furniture, and did his best to restore his home to a sense of normalcy. Neighbors saw a man calm, diligent, and quietly determined. They didn't know that every repair, every adjustment was also a form of preparation. Reinforced doors, secured locks, and subtle alarms were in place, all part of a larger plan that was forming silently in his mind. He also began testing the gang in small ways. A light switched on at a certain time. A shadow moved across a window. A small object appeared in a place it shouldn't. These were not confrontations. They were experiments to gauge their reactions, to see how far their confidence extended. And as expected, they reacted poorly. Their arrogance cracked under subtle pressure, leaving them uncertain and nervous in ways they didn't understand. Each reaction gave him more insight, more understanding, and more advantage. Even as he gathered intelligence, he maintained his composure. To anyone watching, he was calm, collected, and focused on ordinary tasks. But he was always aware. He moved with the discipline ingrained from years of training that demanded constant vigilance. His eyes scanned environments, noticing small details, a tire mark that didn't belong, a door left slightly open, the rhythm of voices on the street. He cataloged every bit of information, creating a mental map of the gang's behavior, weaknesses, and habits. One afternoon, he followed them from a distance as they moved through the neighborhood. Watching their interactions, noting the dynamic between each member, he discovered who was impulsive and likely to act without thinking, who relied on others to lead, and who was overly confident in their own strength. He noticed their routines, when they left their houses, where they gathered, and how long they lingered in certain places. All of this became part of his strategy, silent data he would use later when the time came for direct action. He also started imagining scenarios in his mind, considering every possible outcome. What if they attempted to confront him directly? What if they tried to involve others in the neighborhood? What if they escalated to something more dangerous? He analyzed each scenario with precision, considering how he would respond, what tools he had at his disposal, and how he could ensure the outcome favored him without unnecessary risk. It was a mental rehearsal, a preparation that gave him confidence and clarity. Even as he worked, he remained deeply human. He thought about the people around him, neighbors who were unaware of the danger lurking nearby, families who could be harmed if the gang became more aggressive. He wanted to protect them, to create a boundary they didn't even know existed. He didn't seek recognition or praise. He simply wanted to ensure safety and justice, the way someone who had faced life or death situations before would naturally feel responsible for the ordinary world around them. As the week progressed, the gang began making mistakes. Their growing impatience combined with their arrogance left them more exposed. He noticed one of them attempting to intimidate a neighbor who had no connection to him, simply to assert dominance. Another tripped over an object left deliberately to observe his reaction. These small errors confirmed what he had already suspected. They were predictable, careless, and blind to the consequences of their actions. He also began documenting everything more thoroughly. Not just the big events, but the small details, what they said, how they behaved, and how they responded to minor disruptions. Every note, every observation, added to the growing picture of how to handle the situation. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't angry. He was deliberate, patient, and strategic. That was the difference between someone who survives challenges and someone who becomes a victim of them. As night fell, He often stayed up long hours reviewing what he had learned, adjusting plans and refining strategies. He thought about timing, positioning, and leverage, considering how to maximize advantage while minimizing risk. He wasn't planning chaos for chaos's sake. He was preparing a precise response that would restore balance and ensure safety for himself and others. Despite all this, he remained approachable and calm in his interactions with the neighborhood. He smiled when greeted, spoke kindly to those who came by, and acted as if nothing extraordinary was happening. That calm demeanor was deliberate, a shield that allowed him to operate unseen while observing the gang's behavior. They had no idea they were being watched, studied, and understood. He also reflected on the irony of the situation. Here he was, a man trained to face extreme dangers, navigating life with skills that few could comprehend, yet reduced to observing a gang of arrogant, ignorant individuals who thought they could intimidate him. It was almost absurd, but he found a quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that their ignorance was their weakness. Patience and observation were as powerful as any weapon he had ever used. One evening, he noticed a small escalation. A member of the gang attempted to sneak into a yard to steal, thinking no one would notice. He didn't intervene physically, but he left a subtle signal that someone was aware, a shadow in the corner, a sound of movement that shouldn't be there. The intruder hesitated, unnerved by the sense of being observed, and eventually left without taking anything. It was a small victory, but it was significant. It proved that awareness, calm, and precision could influence behavior without violence. He spent the next few days refining his understanding of the gang. He observed their meetings, the way they communicated, and the way decisions were made. He noticed the hierarchy, the weaknesses, and the impulses that could be exploited. Every observation, every note, every detail was another piece of the plan that would eventually restore order and ensure that respect was re-established without unnecessary harm. Even as he prepared, he never lost sight of the human element. He thought about those around him, the neighbors who feared retaliation, the children who played near danger without knowing it, and the quiet community that needed protection. That human concern was as important as his training. It reminded him that his actions were not about revenge or pride, but about creating a safe environment for people who deserved peace. One night, as he watched from a window, he saw the gang growing restless. Their arrogance was cracking, their confidence faltering under the subtle pressure they didn't understand. They made small mistakes, left gaps in their defenses, and displayed nervous behaviors that confirmed everything he had observed. Each small act of carelessness was another advantage for him, another piece of the puzzle that would make the eventual resolution precise and effective. By the end of the week, he had built a complete picture of the gang's habits, weaknesses, and patterns. He had mapped every route, noted every routine, and understood the dynamics within the group. He knew which members were impulsive, which were cautious, and which relied on others to make decisions. He knew how they responded to pressure, how they communicated, and where they were most vulnerable, and yet, to anyone who watched him, he remained the calm, ordinary man who repaired his home, greeted neighbors politely, and went about his day. That was part of the strategy. The world must not see what was being prepared. They must not suspect the extent of his awareness or the skill he possessed. When the time came, his actions would be precise, controlled, and unstoppable. But for now, patience and observation were the greatest tools at his disposal. He ended each night reflecting on what had been learned, planning the next steps, and preparing mentally for the challenges ahead. He knew the gang would eventually make mistakes, escalate, or overreach. When that moment came, he would be ready. Every action until then was about preparation, every observation about gaining advantage, and every night about maintaining control over a situation that had started with chaos, but would end with balance restored. By the time dawn arrived, he was ready. The gang had no idea what was coming, and the neighborhood remained unaware of the storm quietly forming around them. He moved through the early morning light, calm, measured, and focused. The quiet before the final confrontation was deceptive. He knew exactly what needed to be done and when. Every observation, every action, every preparation had led to this moment. And as he stood in the calm light of morning, he allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. This was not about revenge. It was about balance, safety, and demonstrating that arrogance and ignorance have consequences. It was about showing that true strength is often hidden, quiet, and controlled, but when revealed, impossible to ignore. The stage was set and the resolution was coming. The morning was quiet, almost eerily so. The sun rose slowly, painting the street in soft gold, but the stillness carried a weight, a tension that only those aware of what was to come could feel. He moved through his home with his usual calm, checking doors, windows, and the subtle precautions he had put in place over the past days. Every movement was precise, controlled, and deliberate. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He simply prepared as he always had for the moment when action would be necessary. The gang had grown reckless. Days of subtle pressure, small disruptions, and psychological tactics had worn down their confidence. They moved differently now, cautiously, arguing among themselves, unsure of what was happening or why their control had slipped. They still thought he was ordinary, but even their missteps showed they felt the invisible weight of his presence. That was the opening he had been waiting for. By midday, he began putting the final pieces of his plan into motion. Nothing chaotic, nothing hasty. Everything was precise and controlled. He knew each of their routines, each weakness, and each impulsive behavior. He didn't need brute force. He needed precision, patience, and timing. Every step was calculated to ensure that the gang would have no advantage, that their mistakes would be magnified, and that the consequences would be undeniable. The first encounter happened subtly. He moved through the neighborhood, casually passing by where one of the gang members lingered. A small gesture, a misplaced shadow, a faint sound, a subtle movement, caused the man to freeze, glance around nervously, and ultimately retreat. The psychological impact was immediate. The gang's arrogance had been replaced with doubt, fear, and a sense of exposure they didn't understand. Each small disruption reinforced his presence and control without revealing his true power. By late afternoon, he had orchestrated a situation that would isolate the most reckless member of the gang. That man, impulsive and arrogant, walked a path that he had carefully planned, unaware that every step had been anticipated. He approached silently from a distance, observing, ready to act if necessary, but still allowing the gang member to make mistakes on his own. The brilliance of patience and preparation was in the fact that he did not need to force the outcome. The gang ensured it for him. He had prepared for the possibility of escalation, ensuring that each member was aware, subconsciously, that their behavior was being monitored and that consequences were inevitable. The gang moved like puppets without realizing the strings had already been subtly pulled. His presence, discipline, and awareness dominated the scenario without a single confrontation yet. Each small victory reinforced the imbalance of power that had been building quietly over days. By evening, the tension in the street was palpable. The remaining gang members began gathering near a corner, whispering anxiously. Their confidence was gone. They debated leaving, yet the impulsive member wanted to challenge him directly, unaware that the trap had already been laid. Every argument, every gesture, every word confirmed what he had already known. They had underestimated him, and now their ignorance worked against them. He chose his moment carefully. Calmly, deliberately, he revealed his presence, not in anger, not in a show of force, but as a natural, inevitable outcome of preparation. The impulsive gang member froze, seeing someone who appeared calm, ordinary, and human, but whose eyes betrayed a depth of awareness and control that was impossible to ignore. The remaining members hesitated, unsure of what to do next, their arrogance replaced by hesitation and fear. His approach was simple, yet commanding. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He moved with a confidence born from discipline and preparation, his presence enough to assert dominance without chaos. The gang realized too late that their every move had been anticipated, their weaknesses understood, and their mistakes magnified. The impulsive member tried to act, but the subtle control of the situation left him hesitant, unsure, and ultimately paralyzed. Each member of the gang now faced the consequences of their arrogance. He revealed their mistakes subtly, guiding them into a position where their errors were undeniable, leaving them without an escape. They tried to regain control, but every attempt was anticipated. Every reaction observed, every weakness exploited. There was no need for physical force. The psychological advantage he had built over days was now complete. Even as the confrontation unfolded, he remained human, aware of the impact on the neighborhood and the people around him. He ensured that no innocent was harmed, that no collateral damage occurred, and that the resolution remained precise and just. This was not about revenge. It was about balance, about respect, and about showing that actions have consequences. The gang had learned lessons they would never forget. As night approached, he allowed the authorities to witness the aftermath of the gang's unraveling. Small evidence, subtle signs, and carefully preserved details revealed the truth of what had happened without exposing him fully. The police recognized the dismantling of the gang's influence, but they had no idea the extent of the man's abilities, his training, or the preparation that had led to this outcome. To them, it appeared as a combination of intelligence, observation, and circumstance, but the truth was far more profound. The neighborhood began to breathe easier. The fear that had lingered for days lifted gradually, replaced with a cautious sense of security. People began to repair their homes, interact without hesitation, and resume routines that had been disrupted. The man continued his life quietly, performing ordinary tasks, smiling at neighbors, and repairing his own home with the same calm demeanor. To the community, he remained the man they had always known, disciplined, reliable, and human. Inside, however, he reflected on the events with a deep understanding of cause and effect. He thought about how patience, observation, and preparation had ensured safety without chaos. He thought about the balance between restraint and action, about the quiet strength that comes from discipline, and about the responsibility that came with his skills. This was not a moment for pride or celebration. It was a moment of quiet accomplishment, a demonstration that even the most ordinary-seeming person can possess extraordinary capability when needed. Over the following days, he continued to monitor the neighborhood quietly. The gang, now broken, no longer posed a threat. Their previous confidence had been replaced with fear and hesitation, ensuring that no further disruption would occur. Yet he remained vigilant, aware that life often brought unexpected challenges. Preparation, discipline, and calm awareness would always be necessary, even as he returned to his routine. Going to work, repairing his home, and interacting with neighbors, he remained mindful of the lessons learned. The events had reinforced the value of patience, the power of observation, and the strength of discipline. Every interaction, every choice, and every movement now carried the weight of someone who had navigated danger with precision and control. He also reflected on the human side of the story. He thought about the neighbors who had been unaware of the danger, the families whose safety had been preserved, and the quiet community that could now live without fear. His actions had not been about vengeance or violence. They had been about protection, balance, and justice. That understanding gave him a sense of fulfillment deeper than any recognition could provide. By the end of the week, the neighborhood had returned to a state of normalcy. The streets were alive with children, neighbors spoke freely, and life resumed its ordinary rhythm. Yet the invisible lesson remained. Respect, awareness, and discipline mattered. Those who had tried to disrupt the peace had learned in their own way that underestimating someone could have consequences far beyond what they imagined. He spent one quiet evening on his porch, watching the sunset, reflecting on the journey. It had started with a simple act of vandalism, an attempt to intimidate, and it had ended with a restoration of balance through skill, patience, and strategic thinking. He smiled faintly, not with arrogance, but with quiet satisfaction. The world remained unaware of the full truth, and that was how he preferred it. Recognition was unnecessary. What mattered was the peace, safety, and balance that had been restored. Inside his home, the repairs were finally complete. Broken glass replaced, furniture reset, and his life returned to its ordinary rhythm. Yet beneath the ordinary exterior was a man whose experience, training, and discipline had ensured that threats were neutralized before they could escalate. He was calm, prepared, and ready for whatever the future might bring.